Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. On April 4th, millions of Latter-day Saints worldwide raised their hands to show symbolic support for their new prophet president, Dallin H. It was a rare ritual called a solemn assembly, done primarily at the time of a new leader for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But this act of sustaining is also commonly used in congregations as a way to express goodwill and welcoming to new members and to members who have completed their volunteer assignments or are accepting new ones. Quote, with those raised hands and encouraging smiles, we were participating in common consent, where we can choose to sustain by the raising on of the right hand those called to serve. Apostle Patrick Kearon said right after Oak's solemn assembly, quote, common consent is not a mere formality, but a beautiful mix of our agency, unity, and faith. It is a voluntary personal commitment to support, uphold, and help the Lord's called servants in their responsibility, unquote. And it is almost always unanimous. But does that act imply members are or should be in complete agreement with those who are sustained? Or that the leaders are infallible, or that the thinking among members is done? Here to discuss the church's teachings about sustaining are Taylor Kirby, author of Scrupulous, My Obsessive Compulsion for God. Taylor lives in Mesa, Arizona. And Heather Sundahl, a former editor and current historian and exponent too, and current marriage and family therapist in Provo. Taylor and Heather, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Glad to be here.
Okay, let's dive in for both of you. What does the word sustain mean to you in the context of supporting church leaders? Heather, want to start with you?
Sure. I think of it in two ways. The first way I think of it is sort of as structural support, like scaffolding. So when you sustain in this sense, you're part of the system that says, I will keep something upright. I will uphold this. Like a functional thing, like a pillar. And words I associate with that are acceptance and obedience. But I also see sustain as cultivate, where it's more about sustenance, nourishment. How do you keep something alive? And in this way, it's a little more agentive. I mean, they're two very different models because nourishing requires the diversity of nutrients, whereas the more upholding, I think of it like a garden. If you're planting beans, you've got to have those structures so that the beans have something to climb and those sustain it. But you also have to water it. You've also got to look for snails. And so I think both senses are important, but as Latter-day Saints, we tend to defer to the scaffolding, to the, we're going to uphold this.
Taylor?
Yeah, I want to reiterate how grateful I am to be here, and I hope what I'm about to say doesn't undermine me as a choice to be on this panel today. But as to the question, what does it mean to sustain our church leaders, I want to be very candid. I don't fully know. And when I say I don't fully know, what I'm really trying to say is I'm not sure we really know as Latter-day Saints. I think that this is an area that requires greater revelation and greater thought and consideration as members seeking to fulfill our commission. With that said, I have some thoughts that I think shed some light on it, but I want to be clear, none of this is meant to communicate some sort of holistic understanding of what it means to be a sustaining voice. To that end, the word sustain itself is really kind of odd. I can't think of a time outside of church leadership or outside of a church context where I use the word sustain outside of music, when we talk about sustaining a note, holding a note across measures or something. With that said, for my purposes here, I'm going to try to use the word support rather than sustain, as I think most of us would argue that more or less means the same thing. And I granted, I think we could quibble over that, but if I think, what does it mean to support my church leaders? My thoughts go to my relationship with my wife. When I married my wife, Rachel, I promised to always support her. There is no time limit on how long I need to support her. For as long as I am married to her, I support her. And yet we all recognize that there are some limits to what that support would entail. And forgive me if this comes off a little silly, but if my wife were to come home tomorrow and she were to say, Taylor, I was doing some thinking and I really feel like I need to start robbing banks. I need to become a criminal. I'm going to buy a domino mask and I'm going to start holding up Wells Fargo's. I am not obliged to support her in that calling. If she is going to do, and again, this is silly, but if I had a church leader, okay, who was asking me to do something that would cause harm to myself or to others, I am not obliged to follow that. Now, at a less dramatic example, let's imagine my wife, whom I have covenanted to support. Let's imagine she comes home and she says, Taylor, I was doing some thinking. We need to move to Portland. There's this great professional opportunity for me in Portland, and there's a lot of other opportunities for you in Portland. Let's move to Portland. In that context, in something that is far more reasonable than robbing banks, I am still not quite obliged to immediately and blindly and without thinking rent the U-Haul to get us to Portland. What I am obliged to do is consider the move to Portland. I am obliged to sit down and have a discussion, hopefully a thoughtful, prayerful, meaningful, nuanced discussion over what Portland has to offer us over Phoenix or Mesa or wherever we're going to live. And through conversation and dialogue together, we would come to a confirmation of whether or not Portland is for us. All of which is to say, I don't know what it means to sustain, but I do know that there is no scenario where it requires some sort of blind and thoughtless devotion. God is always expecting us to think seriously about what it means for us to be disciples.
That leads to a question I have. Do you view it differently, or should it be viewed differently when sustaining, say, a church president versus a bishop or a Relief Society president, or the person over the activities committee in your congregation? Is there a qualitative difference in the sustaining on those levels? Taylor, let's start with you this time.
I do think that there is. I think at the local level, when we sustain someone, essentially what we're saying is, I'm going to be there for you. If I'm sustaining the activities coordinator, I don't know if that's still a calling. I think that might have been rebranded in one of the latest iterations. But in any event, if I'm sustaining the activities coordinator, essentially what I'm saying is, listen, man, when you need someone to help get the chairs at the end of the day, you can give me a call. Also, if you are struggling and you need some help, give me a call. And also, I'm going to be patient with you if the activity wasn't that great. I'm going to recognize that you're trying the best you can, and you deserve some grace. At minimum, I think that sustaining someone at the local level is a process that probably requires less consideration and is probably more about the service you can offer them at an interpersonal level as vis-a-vis what their calling will demand of them.
Heather, what about you?
So, I agree with Taylor that the stakes are probably lower on the ward level. Like when you're getting a Temple Recommend interview, they don't ask you, do you sustain the activities committee chair? you signed up for a casserole and you didn't bring it, therefore we're going to take your recommend way. Like, that's most likely not going to happen. And I think that things do get trickier the higher up you go. And if I can, I'd like to share a little story about something that I learned from my mother in terms of sustaining and going up against a recommendation of the prophet. So back in 1987, Ezra Taft Benson gave a talk calling women to come home from the workplace. It was very much a talk that Spencer Kimball had originally given, and he kind of echoed it and added on to it. And the church went so far as to print pamphlets of this talk. And my mom was Stake Relief Society president, so she gets this big box of pamphlets of this talk. And my mother is a very obedient woman. I stress her out. I am the youngest child. I'm not as obedient. So I always look to her for, what my mom does is always like right on the money. So she gets this and she starts thinking about the women in the stake, and she starts imagining handing this pamphlet to women who are working so that they can feed their families. My mom was working at the time because my dad's job didn't provide insurance. And my mother was like, we need insurance. Like, I am going to work. And she wrestled because she's so dutiful. It was a real wrestle for her. And she had to weigh, what does it mean to sustain the prophet? And what does it mean for me to take this calling and raise my own hand and sustain myself and say that I will do everything in the best interests of these women that I'm serving? My mother ultimately chose not to pass out the pamphlets. I don't know if she threw it away. I don't know if it just kind of went into storage. But for me, that was such an act of bravery to see my mom wrestling with these different goods. And, we all have values. And I think that as Latter-day Saints, we really value obedience. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there are times where there are other values that are more important. And my mother looked at these women, and sustaining and supporting them in taking care of their families was more important.
So to both of you, building on that, by sustaining a person or a quorum or something, does that mean you agree with them, with the person or the quorum? What do you think? Building on that, Heather, do you think it means agreeing with?
Okay, so as a therapist, particularly a marriage and family therapist, I spend so much time working with teenagers and their parents. And what I have learned is that one of the biggest distinctions that we can make is the difference between accepting something and agreeing with it. These kids can often accept, mom and dad are going to give a curfew to me. I don't agree with it, but I can accept it. I don't have to like it, but I can understand why they would feel that was necessary. And that is one of the biggest parts of communication and in listening, is having that ability to sort of hold those two tensions at once, to be able to know how you feel and to not, you can't make people agree with things, but you can get them to accept and to sort of hold that tension like, well, I don't really agree that it's great for members to go and clean the church. I don't love that. I don't agree with that policy, but do I show up and clean church toilets? I do, because I accept that. For me, that one is not as big of a conflict with, I can't justify that I have some greater value that's more important than that. So it's hard to live with that tension, but I think it's something that you're healthier and happier if you can navigate accepting versus agreeing.
Yes, Heather is right. I think that that's really, really smart. I would add to it this, that I think it matters actually that we are asked to sustain the person rather than the ideas. For instance, at this last solemn assembly, we were not asked, do you agree with all of Dallin Oak's conference talks? We were asked, do you sustain Dallin Oaks? And I think that that's a fundamentally different question. And to use the analogy of a marriage again, I can support my wife while also having disagreements with my wife about stuff. I think that's perfectly plausible. How to make sense of all of that at a personal or theological level, I think is a much more confusing question. And one place that I continue to go back to at a personal theological level is the story of the Garden of Eden. And I really appreciate Heather's story of her mother in that pamphlet. And I really appreciate how Heather framed it, because when we are asked as Latter-day Saints to consider ourselves as though we are Adam or Eve, I would invite Latter-day Saints to think about the situation Adam and Eve found themselves in. They found themselves in a situation in which they perceived themselves to have conflicting goods, conflicting commandments. Heather's mother perceived herself to be caught between two conflicting goods: the commandment, as it were, to give out this pamphlet, and the reality that giving out that pamphlet would cause harm, or maybe to frame it differently, the reality that working for many of those women was a very good thing, something that not only provided goodness to their families, but also self-actualization to the women. And it is my conviction, I don't think God is as interested in seeing how we handle the clear right versus wrong choices as he is interested in seeing how we grow and develop through the more complicated, there isn't quite a right versus wrong choice to be made here. That's essentially what happened in the Garden of Eden, and that is often the situation in which we find ourselves in. All of which is to say, as it pertains to sustaining, and does this mean I agree, and to what extent do I need to do this and that? I think we need to be better as members of the church in recognizing that life is messy, and that's actually how God intended it. And it is through the very hard mess that we develop and grow and become more godly. I would not become a more godly person if I was just given right versus wrong choices all the time. You could program an AI to get through right versus wrong choices. It takes a human level of thought and understanding and pondering and praying and searching and looking into the void and all of those things to navigate these more complicated questions. And we need to recognize that life is messy. We also need to be a little bit more patient with our fellow members of the church as they navigate their own mess, and recognize that what my life of sustaining the brethren looks like could be very different than what my neighbor's life of sustaining the brethren looks like. We're all making, I think, the best choices we can in the context of our own complicated and messy situations.
Yeah, as we're dissecting sort of nuances we see in the language of sustaining, I'm just wondering, from your observations, how do you think most members view the sustaining of leaders, maybe culturally? Do you think they view it this way, or do they see it somehow more simply? Heather, why don't you start?
I think it depends on the person. I think that there are people who don't enjoy the wrestle, people who like things to be laid out and made clear. But even then it's problematic, because if you're like, okay, well, this is how the temple is and this is what it's like. Well, it's changed at least 5 times since I went through. I mean, if we talk about garments, and so it's hard if you decide that this is the way it is, because it's going to change. It's going to change. And so I think that some people, I mean, I think my mother is one of these people. It's easier for her to obey than it is for me. I was born, that the soul so rebellious and proud is mine. I'm always like, yeah, that's me. That line was written for me. But I think there's room for both. If you see things as more straightforward and it's like, well, I'm doing this because that's what was said, good for you. But other people are just more inclined to get into the weeds in it. And I love that Taylor was talking about the Garden of Eden. I refer to that as our origin story. And the purpose of an origin story is it really kind of contains the kernel of what everything is about. And it is messy. The whole origin story was like, there was no way to get out of there without there being wrestling and a quandary. And some of my favorite leaders that I've had have been ones who've made mistakes and then they've acknowledged it and they've modeled, this is how we get through. I mean, to be human means you're going to screw up. That is the definition of human. Like, we're all human. When people say that, they mean we're going to screw up. So back to your question, some people really do like things more straightforward. It's less problematic for them. And others of us have a hard time just accepting things straight out without the wrestle.
Taylor, how do you see how members view sustaining generally as you see it?
Yeah, I think Heather's right on the money. The only thing I would add is that it is 100% the case that there are a lot of members that want it all. I think, given very simply, and have come, I think, to rely on the church as something that can provide them a sort of simple step-by-step way of approaching life. The trouble is, and I think perhaps I'm observing it more, or perhaps it's happening more often, those that have depended on the more simplistic approach, there often comes a point where that stops working. And when the simplistic approach stops working, it can become particularly devastating for someone who always imagined that the pondering and the praying and the deep nuanced thinking about it all wasn't as necessary. All of which is to say, I sometimes when we have these conversations, or conversations like these, we will think about this group that tends to just, I want to say this the right way. When we have conversations like this, I think we sometimes imagine this group that goes with the church and will always be with the church as being sort of okay no matter what. And I'm just not convinced that that's always the case. It's been my experience that sometimes that group that has relied on the church for simple answers and has taken a more simplistic approach to faith, it's often the case that trials of faith can hit them with a special force. And so anyway, there is something to be said for thoughtful engagement, even if you don't think that engagement is really necessary.
Okay, well, speaking of that, to both of you, have you ever voted no on sustaining? And second part of that question is, has there come a time in your life when you had to really wrestle with sustaining and caused by some kind of conflict? Taylor, I know you've written about scrupulosity. Mm-hmm. So, first of all, ever voted no? Second of all, ever had a conflict with sustaining?
Yeah, I've never voted no, largely because I'm not brave enough. But I have had experiences with bishops or other leaders where I truly felt in my heart of hearts that they weren't the right man for the job. That sounds harsh. I was reading Elder Kearon's talk that you referenced earlier earlier, Peggy, and there's this line early on in the talk that made me laugh out loud, where he says he asks rhetorically, "Will we always agree with those we are invited to sustain? Will we always think they are doing a good job and serving as the Savior would? Perhaps not, and we might be right." All of which is to say, life is complicated, life is messy. I have tried to say that, and I've as muddled away as I did today. I just want to add that it is also the hard reality that people can get those sort of things wrong. Everyone in charge of filling callings and making decisions are also people who can be wrong, and that is as true as it is that we as members of the church and good people trying to follow Jesus Christ have an obligation to be compassionate towards them and to support them as best we can. How to make sense of all of that? At what point does someone need to be released rather than just rely on the goodwill and support of the membership? I don't know. That may be a question that's beyond my pay grade a little bit, but all of which is to say, sustaining is also not a magic trick, I guess, is maybe the big point I'm trying to make. we can show our love, we can show our support. And sometimes people just aren't going to be great at their jobs. And we still have a responsibility to love them. And it's still true that someone might not have been a great match for that job.
Heather, have you ever voted no? Have you ever
No, I
had a
haven't.
conflict?
This is really tricky. I feel like it's a very flawed process, Peggy. So members today don't have any really good options when it comes to sustaining a leader that they don't believe is acting or can act in accordance with the gospel. They either have to raise their arm to the square when asked if any are opposed, and they incur shaming. And you are also shaming the person who's up there for the calling. So you've got this double whammy, and there's ridicule that's going to follow. People talk about it. People remember when somebody raises their hand and objects. So then your other option is just to raise your hand and kind of rubber stamp a sustaining vote. And then I feel like it erodes the integrity of what should be this thing of like, yeah, for better or for worse, I'm going to try to get behind you and help you do this. I mean, I remember the one time I watched it happen. I had a roommate and they were sustaining her to be music leader in our student ward at BYU. And she raised her hand and opposed because nobody had asked her. And I loved her. I love that she was like, no, sorry, we've got to have a conversation about this. But really, what's the process? I don't know. I find it very problematic. And in this day and age, I think we do need a better process. When someone is being called as a bishop or a stake president, to my knowledge, no women are consulted in that process. There aren't any women who are consulted. And people can be very different. Women can get a vibe on a dude that men don't get. Women can be like, oh, no, something ain't right. Like, I don't trust him. I don't want to be alone in a room with him. And that other be like, oh my gosh, she's fabulous. I do feel like we need a process. We need a better process because raising your hand and shaming yourself and shaming someone else, most of us aren't going to do. So I do my kind of passive aggressive where I just don't raise my hand. And I kind of say to God, like, I'm not going to throw a fit here, but I may be like, I told you so later on.
I want to talk about post-sustaining, if that's okay. Once you've sustained, does that mean you can't criticize a leader or a teaching or whatever? Taylor, what do you think?
Well, let me answer your question, but I want to touch on something that Heather said that I just want to reiterate a couple of points because I think they're really, really important. One thing that we lack at a structural level is a mechanism to voice dissent. We don't have any sort of meaningful way of making our dissenting voices heard. And I think that is a problem for a couple reasons. Number one is when you read the Doctrine and Covenants, it seems like God would like there to be one. Like God says all things need to be done through common consent. And if you cannot voice dissent, it's hard for me to see how we can justifyingly call a system common consent, right? Not everyone's consenting. The other problem is that good revelation is actually a collective enterprise. The LDS Mormon doctrine of revelation is not one where like God shoots an email down to somebody. Our model of revelation, as articulated to Oliver Cowdery in the Doctrine and Covenants, is one where we take in the stuff and we ponder about the stuff, we think about the stuff, and if the conclusion is right, we feel that affirmation, right? In other words, there is this constructive element that has to occur in order for the revelation to occur. And in some ways, and this is a reductive allegory, but in computing science, they often say garbage in, garbage out. If I'm not putting enough good data into the machine, I can't expect good data to come out of the machine. So to Heather's point about women not being consulted about stake presidents or bishops or countless other positions in the church, that's data that we are excluding from the revelation machine, right? Like we are actually putting blinders on what we are allowing God to confirm for us when we are artificially narrowing the scope of the data we are bringing to the divine conversation. I think that this is really, really important, actually, as it pertains especially to callings where real harm can be done. We've used the example of the activity coordinator, and I made some flippant jokes, but the reality is the activity coordinator could do a very bad job and life's still going to go on. Like, if the ward Christmas party sucks, Christmas is still going to come, right? Like, it's all going to be okay. If the bishop isn't doing his job right, or the young men's president isn't doing his job correctly, or the young women's president isn't doing her job correctly, there's real harm that can happen and can be perpetuated. And to that end, it's important that our revelation prior to the sustaining be a little better. And in order to improve the quality of the revelation, which we in LDS thought think of as an affirmation from God, right? In order to improve that affirmation, we need to be bringing better data to the table beforehand.
So then, can you criticize after sustaining?
Number one, incredible journalism, holding my feet to the fire of the original question that I danced around answering. But when you ask, can you criticize? My initial sort of petty response is, yeah, you can. But the more mature and I think realistic and true answer to your question is, criticize to what end? There are different ways there are different forms that criticism can take that would be helpful or unhelpful. If I feel that my young men's president is doing a bad job of modeling Christ-like behavior for the young men in the ward, I could gossip about him and sort of secretly shame him, in private conversation, or I could have a conversation with the bishop or the stake president. Now, to Heather's point, we really don't have, and we really need some sort of systemic way to process this. We don't have one. But in any event, I think criticism is morally acceptable, provided it is criticism towards a more meaningful end, rather than a source of entertainment unto itself.
Heather, what do you think?
So I'm going to stick to the ward level because I think that's where, if I have an issue with something, instead of criticizing, sometimes there are actions you can take. Sometimes there are things you can do to be involved to make things better. And there have been times where I've had an interaction with, say, a bishop or a counselor in a recommend interview, where I have then, after I've cooled down and kind of, put myself back together, I've said to them, I need you to know how that felt to me during that interview. It made me really uncomfortable when you got some very detailed questions about my garment wearing. As a woman, it makes me very uncomfortable to have a man asking me these questions. And so the fact that I'm here doing it, I think shows a lot of faith. And you may want to reconsider how you approach this in the future, because I'm not the only one that feels this way. So, and granted, I'm older. I'm kind of in that menopausal, I do not care what they think of me phase. And it's been very liberating. And I actually think I've had some wonderful conversations with bishops that when I was 30 or 40, I might not have. But now at this point, I'm like, what's he going to do? Dock my pay? Like fire me from Teaching Relief Society? Like, there's just not that much. And I feel like we're all in this together. And if I'm going to sustain someone, then I do have an obligation. If there is not some little dumb thing like, why did you pick that as the theme for Easter? Why'd you, whatever, but something that I think is not just harmful to me, but could potentially be harmful to other people, I do feel an obligation to sit down and have an uncomfortable conversation. And it may not do any good, but I at least can kind of look myself in the mirror and know that, like, I am trying to sustain these people. I am trying to, water and get it enough sun and observe, and support so that the harvest is good. And that's on all of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, last question. Clearly, there could be improvements in the system, as Heather has said. But what are the strengths? What do you think are the strengths of this sustaining system that maybe we don't see in other faith groups or other communities we live in? What do you think are the strengths of it?
So for me, if I am going to raise my hand and say, yes, I sustain this person in this calling, I then feel like that is buy-in on my part. I have agreed that I will play along, I will participate. I mean, whoever the Relief Society president is, she didn't put a sign on her lawn saying, Sister so-and-so for Relief Society president. Like, this person was called, and they've got all sorts of other things going on in their lives. And so I feel an obligation to support them. And for me, that sustaining thing, even though it's imperfect, it does at least acknowledge that for this whole church to function, both on a worldwide level and on a ward or branch level, it requires cooperation, participation, and buy-in. And so I appreciate that. I don't take it for granted that it's like voting. It's like, if I vote, I get to complain. My friends who don't vote, if they start complaining, I'm like, sorry, you did not show up. So sustaining someone is like voting. You're saying, all right, I am invested. This is something that matters, and I am going to try to make this work.
Taylor, last comment.
Yeah, I think everything Heather said is absolutely correct. To the strength of the system, one thing that I was thinking about as I was pondering this prior to the interview is that as we've tossed around questions relating to the relationship between sustaining and infallibility, etc., one thing that strikes me is that the very principle of by common consent suggests that our leaders are fallible, that our leaders can make mistakes, and that God wants us to think about the decisions these leaders make, because we are less likely to all be wrong than we are for one person to be wrong. And I actually think that the symbolism of that is rather powerful. To that end, and forgive me if I'm going outside the parameters of your question a little bit, but one point that I wanted to make sure to emphasize is that recognizing the fallible nature of our leaders, for me, has been something, paradoxically, that has allowed me to sustain my faith. Those who believe that our leaders are perfect will be disappointed in very real and visceral ways. And I can say this at a personal level. As some listeners may or may not know, my daughters, their mother is a lesbian. She is a member of the LGBTQ community, and we were divorced a couple of years ago, and that my daughter was 7 years old when the November 5th policy became a thing, and it would have, had it stayed enacted, barred my daughter from being baptized. My feelings on that could stretch into a whole nother podcast interview, and I don't mean to divert us from the thing. But one thing that has helped me maintain my faith and my sustaining of these church leaders, despite what I think was a really egregious error, and something that they admit was an egregious error, is my recognition that from the get-go, these were not perfect people. These were people. And if we are serious about keeping people in the fold and helping people maintain their membership and affiliation with us through their crises of faith, we need to be more honest, and we need to be more honest and open about the reality of prophetic fallibility. It is the recognition that these people whom we sustain are nevertheless valuable. That, in my experience, is what is going to help keep people in the fold rather than the opposite.
This has been fascinating. Heather Sundahl and Taylor Kirby, thanks so much for joining us today and talking about this important topic. And thanks to Dave Noyes.
Thanks, Peggy. Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.